And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hi, this is Drew Perkins. I am the Director of Teach Thought Professional Development and also the host of this Teach Thought podcast. I want to thank you for listening if you're a return listener or a new listener, and encourage you to share with folks who you think also might be interested. It's certainly one of my joys of the work that I get to do, insofar as I get to talk to really interesting people, engage in their work, and hopefully expand my own thinking as well as yours as an educator. We've got some great podcasts coming up soon, including one on the reading wars that you might have heard quite a bit about in social media and other places. We also have one coming up with Paul Kirshner, who is mentioned in this podcast, and some others of note, including one with the CEO of the NASSP, National Association of Secondary School Principals. So if any of those are of interest to you, I would encourage you to subscribe and, of course, leave reviews and share with folks who you think might enjoy it. I would also encourage you to visit WeGrowTeachers.com if you are interested in our professional development services. We do lots of project-based learning work, and all of our work is through the lens of inquiry. We also offer services like professional development on differentiated instruction, as I mentioned, inquiry, literacy, assessment, and a whole host of other things, including admin and leadership work. If you have any questions or comments for me, I encourage you to email me at drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Zach Groshell, who is an educator in the Seattle area and hosts a podcast called Progressively Incorrect, and also has a blog that he publishes on. Zach and I have sparred a few times here and there on Twitter, and he is a staunch advocate of direct and explicit instruction, and as most of you, I'm sure, if you've listened to this podcast, know I am an advocate of inquiry-based education. So we brought our Twitter fight, as it were, to a podcast, and I appreciated him coming on and having what I thought was a really good and interesting conversation, as maybe you think about the ways in which direct and explicit instruction and inquiry or project-based learning might come together to be actually a really great sweet spot for education ideally. But some of the challenges in doing that, some of the ways in which that looks inside of project-based learning, some of the things that I would criticize of other practitioners or folks doing project-based learning. So again, I appreciate Zach coming on. It's always interesting to get somebody on who will push back on the thinking that I have so that I can learn more, and hopefully you find it helpful. All right, I'm here with Zach Groshell, and Zach and I are going to have intellectual fisticuffs and hash it out here. I will have to say, anybody who hears me today, I am intellectually fighting with one hand behind my back because I haven't been feeling particularly well over the last couple days. This is news to Zach, so he's already thinking, oh, great, he's making excuses already. So I'll try to edit out any of the coughs and coughing that I might have, but Zach, welcome to the podcast, and I'll give a little background on why we're talking maybe a little bit, and feel free to fill in some of those things before I do as well. But introduce yourself, and then we can get at the fisticuffs.
Yeah, and I thank you for having me on. I mean, I love the kind of friendly debate format, so I think we'll be talking a little bit about explicit teaching and inquiry learning. So my name is Zach Groshell. I am a teacher, an elementary teacher by training, but recently I moved into instructional coaching. So I help teachers to develop their craft knowledge and embed sort of research-based practices into the classroom. I work a lot with new teachers to develop sort of behavior management kind of, routines and norms and things in the classroom. And I blog a lot. I blog at educationrickshaw.com. On Twitter quite often, and I think the main reason you came across sort of my musings is because I often talk about cognitive science and a lot of times I talk about behavior management and direct instruction. I've also been involved in a number of projects, including the Amplify Learning book. I wrote a chapter on assessment and feedback, and I finished a PhD in instructional design recently. So yeah, that's me.
All right, and I actually came upon you first somehow when you, I guess, had tweeted a podcast that you had done with Paul Kirshner, who is actually going to be on the podcast in a couple weeks. I'm looking forward to that. And he, of course, is, I guess you'd characterize him as an education researcher. I don't know if there's a better characterization of him, but he and a host of other folks are maybe best a way to characterize it on your side of the sort of debate, the argument that we seem to be having on Twitter and that kind of thing. So, I'd heard of you and he talking when I'm always trying to figure out where I'm wrong and how quickly I can change my mind if I find that I am wrong, which actually, one of the things I don't think you mentioned is, and I think I'm correct on this, is that you used to be at least somewhat of an advocate or using what you would say is inquiry-based or something like that when you were first starting out and have shifted over the years. So maybe, give us a little backstory on that.
Yeah, well, I would say I started teaching not with any teaching pattern in mind, right? I think when you come out of teaching school, you're just looking to establish yourself. You're looking to do right by your kids and in any way possible. And maybe you're not really looking for a particular method. You're just trying to look towards what works. I would call that probably default new teaching, default new teacher instruction, where I was probably leading a lot with my personality and just spending a lot of weekends and evenings just trying to figure out the curriculum and how to teach. Mm-hmm. But I did move pretty quickly from my original school to international schools overseas. And overseas, in terms of these private schools, the tuition can be up in the $40,000 range per year. And so you're catering to very wealthy families. And it tends to be, and I say this from having gone to many different conferences and such, it tends to be that the preferred teaching method can kind of or approaches and beliefs and philosophy can kind of go under that progressive education or sort of constructivist inspired education. Mm-hmm. It tends to be that's what across the board is preferred. I don't know if it's because wealthy parents just want, maybe they know they can give them after school tutoring, or maybe they think that the projects are worthwhile or whatever, but that just tends to be what it is. So I was trained in sort of IB schools using inquiry cycles, where we would begin with like a exploratory phase where the students kind of explore what questions they want to pose. Then maybe the students would pose a question that they wanted to explore. And then they would usually design a project or an action or service project sort of pretty quickly, and end by presenting it or by disseminating it in some way through the internet maybe. That was every unit for 6 units of schools that I worked at for 7 years, mm-hmm. right? So highly project-based. It was called inquiry-based learning, but I would say it's probably more aligned with sort of a free, non-enhanced, discovery-based approach, where students are meant to discover the material for themselves. They're meant to find it for themselves mm-hmm. through their own volition, mm-hmm. and the teacher's meant to serve as a facilitator, a guide on the side, right. through much of it, through almost all of it.
Right. Okay. So, boy, there's so many threads to pull on. And so for folks who are unaware, because probably most people are not paying attention to your Twitter feed and my Twitter feed and the swords that are crossing there. But one of the things that I'm an advocate, as anybody listening to this podcast will know, of inquiry-based education, and whether you call it progressivism, constructivism, I think it makes sense to operationalize some of these terms as we talk about this. But there's an explicit, no pun intended, explicit pushback by a group, a crowd, yourself included, Paul Kirshner, Carl Hendrick, Greg Ashman, probably Edie Hirsch, I would say, others. Maybe you can add to that list. You probably can add to that list, saying that, kind of as you said, that well, at least you alluded to that, this sort of teaching is not what's best for kids, right? That direct and explicit instruction is better, more efficient. I don't know how you'd characterize it differently, and there's probably several different ways to do that, right? So what we kind of go back and forth about is that sort of dichotomy, which I think is a false dichotomy, right? One of my biggest frustrations, aside from the sort of just kind of flippant aspersions, casting of aspersions that I guess Twitter is really well designed for, is what seems to me to be a real conflation of, you mentioned discovery learning, constructivism, inquiry, project-based learning, almost like all of those things are basically the same thing. And, perhaps, to give some grace, perhaps that is not intended because Twitter's, 280 characters now, and, in the limited space, maybe that's by a sort of factor of that. But, when I read in books, I read Edie Hirsch, and it seemed like he did some of that. I think the book that Paul and Carl put together when reading, How Teaching Happens, How Learning Happens, they seem to make some conflations there. So I would say, and I do say to teachers when I'm working with them, that, as I joke, we're not looking for free-range chicken. And I would describe it as, and have often, is like on one end of the spectrum, you might have the most traditional didactic, drill and kill, like you can imagine what that might be caricaturized as. And on the other end is the caricature is free-range chicken, right? Kids just sort of directing their own learning and an adult being in the room just to keep the fires from starting or whatever, right? And of course, there's lots of room in between there. So, that's the thing that really sort of gets my fire going. It's like project-based learning and inquiry doesn't work because discovery learning doesn't work. And it's like, well, but they're not the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I've heard it too, right? And remember, I didn't write the Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark article of 2006 that uses all of these in the same title, right? I think it's a really powerful article, but I don't usually get hung up on that piece, and here's why. When you're a teacher and you're a new teacher coming into your classroom, these are decisions that are real, right? You're sitting there in front of your students, 30 students, 28 students, and you have to make a lot of day-to-day decisions, and you have to sort of develop your own philosophy on how to teach. One way you could go is to add more and more structures to your class. You can go the direction of, essentially, I'm going to lead the learning, I'm going to control the environment, and I'm only going to allow them to do really what they want to do after a very gradual, slow release from teacher control to student control. Mm-hmm. That's one, like you said, then you could go almost so far that you never release the control, and I think that's terrible teaching, right?
Right. Lecture assess, lecture assess,
right. There's the other direction. That's why I don't think it's a false dichotomy, that I think it exists and it's real, because you can go the opposite direction. You can essentially pull back structures. You can really put a lot of responsibility on the students right away or too early, or you can really hope that through group work and collaboration and sort of independent problem solving, that they will come to the same knowledge. They will move themselves towards that material just as fast as you would have if you had personally brought it to them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so for me, that's where it exists. However, I do concede your point already that if we're talking in a Twitter sphere, if we're talking anywhere, and I keep on basically doing this little tactic of saying, like, actually that's terrible, but I was really referring to discovery learning, and then I go move back and now we're talking about projects, that can really be confusing and it can not be helpful at all.
Right. Well, No, to your point, and I think that is a reality. There's usually at this point I look over to my bookshelf and then realize it's probably upstairs, but I mispronounced the guy's name, Mikhail Goyal or something. I think the book is like Schools on Trial, and he's an advocate for this sort of free learning where students do whatever they want, or learn what they want when they want, and that kind of thing. And actually, I just recently, last week, had dinner with somebody, and she actually her thing is that she is against compulsory public education. I said, well, tell me more. Of course, like I have to know what's on your mind here. And she is an advocate of self-directed learning, and I, as being the contrarian I am, even if I agree, I'm going to push back, right? So a lot of the same kinds of things and characterized the way you might say it. And of course, my question there, or one of my questions was, what about the importance of shared knowledge? Because I think Edie Hirsch makes a really good point insofar as the cohesiveness of a culture and society and what we have in common as, sort of foundational knowledge and pieces. And of course, there's always going to be extraneous things that people might know individually or regionally or whatever. But there does seem, it resonates with me that we would have some sort of through lines and that kind of thing. That, the argument there is, of course, they will pick it up as they go. I don't know if she or they would say that they'd pick it up at the same speed, but regardless, they'll pick it up in due time, and life will be good, and they will never have to suffer the terrible, awful things of sitting in a classroom and being directed by a teacher, right? So all of those things I think are true, and the thing maybe to focus on or to dive a little more deeply here is, and this is one of the things you and I have gone back and forth on, you say, well, this is my duty, my job, the weight is on me, right? The ball's in my court to explain this, right? Of what project-based learning is, which is hard, right? Somebody asked me, and I was writing a chapter in a book myself, defining project-based learning. And so what is project-based learning? And that is, as I say, a slippery term, right? It's project-based learning. When we go do workshops with teachers and they say, it's a project-based learning workshop, oftentimes teachers say, oh, I've been doing project-based learning for years. And they're really not doing what we would say project-based learning. It's doing something more like projects. And then there's, the different providers and people that do project-based learning work. What I say is, maybe in a nutshell, in a short elevator ride, is, the students are learning important content and knowledge through the process of doing a project, and this is, I think, a big differentiator in the work that we do and the way that I view it, because I think it's super, super important. They are learning how to identify, ask, and then, of course, pursue answering and resolving the important questions and being able to do something well. And in those projects, we almost always, unless it's like a genius hour or something that isn't concerned with particular content, we want specific content knowledge, standards, whatever you want to call them, as that need to know and learn list, like those questions that we're pulling out as the need to know and learn list. And so that inquiry process, and when I think about the importance of as we talk about preparing students for the modern world, one of the things, among many, is the problem-solving ability of being able to sort of frame problems and things through questions, right? So practicing that, having a teacher model that, and using that as a sort of guide of the cognitive terrain we want students to travel, and connecting our teaching to that. To me, if you're not doing that, then it's missing the boat in project-based learning. And I well admit that does happen in lots of cases, and there are providers and people who work in professional development on project-based learning who I think miss that boat.
Yeah. I'd say that's a good description. Two things kind of pop out to me from what you said would be is there a way to develop those same skills or knowledge and actually do some hands-on practical work with projects through the explicit instruction model that I sort of described, but basically starting with a teacher personally bringing knowledge to students through an I do phase, moving into sort of a collaborative, interactive phase of I do, we do loops, and then really finally ending with you do, where the students do it themselves.
Right.
We have projects here, right? And I've never been at a school that doesn't have projects, right? So the idea that a project has to be, and not saying you said this, but the idea that some providers may suggest that a project has to begin in an inquiry style phase, a loop, like a cycle in which it really begins with students identifying the material they want to learn, pursuing that material on their own, with a teacher facilitating. Like that, to me, I don't see that being necessary. And I see this with my teachers who do lots of projects. Typically they come to me and they'll say, I don't understand, like they're making something and my behavior is my classroom management is great and I'm doing everything the curriculum says to do. And honestly, they've made a slide deck and they don't know anything about the material that they chose for themselves. And always the first thing I would suggest would be like, did you pre-teach any of the material? Did you go ahead and did you sit down and just personally instruct them on that material? Well, no, I was trying to do it the project-based way where they find it out. And I go, well, look, it failed, right? And so, I mean, that's where I find the kind of the hard part about some forms of project-based learning. The second piece that I think would be important to mention, I forgot what it was. What else did you say?
Well, while you're trying to remember that, so and this is where the false dichotomy, I think, comes in, because there's the dichotomy of the sort of spectrum and one end and the other. But what I would say and often say in professional development settings and in working with teachers or podcast or whatever, is that direct and explicit instruction lives very well and perfectly well inside of a project-based learning experience. 2 or 3 weeks ago was talking to a group of superintendents. Kentucky has a giant deeper learning grant, and they're going to be doing lots of work, and project-based learning will be a part of that. So I was talking about deeper learning and how inquiry works with that and how it can augment that and make it really powerful, and some of the things you need to keep in mind, like identify what you want to teach, actually teach it, and assess it, right? Groundbreaking stuff, right? But making sure that we are not going for behavioral engagement, but going for cognitive engagement. Making sure that as we plan a project, there is that clarity of cognitive landscape, the terrain we want them to travel, right? These are the 6 or 7 or whatever, however many you want to say content standards or however you want to use that language, and say, how do I pull those out as questions and get them and help them identify them as important questions. And then as my teaching, and this is where I would make some distinction, and people say, well, I need to front load this teaching. I need to pre-teach it, right? I would say we teach it through the project. We're still teaching it, and we're teaching it, and I think even as I was reading some of the things, if I'm remembering correctly, Paul and Carl's books, I think they use the just-in-time language, or one of the people that they were talking about use that, and it's essentially that, right? It's like, we needed to know how to multiply, subtract, and divide and add decimals. So we're going to do some work on that today, tomorrow, or whatever you like. We're going to do some explicit teaching. We're going to do some practice. We're going to do some assessment. Like, all of those pieces would be embedded in there. The real distinction, again, that I make is like helping students identify those questions, because to me, that's a skill that is foregone if we don't actually do it.
Yeah, now I remember what I was thinking, and everything you said, I think you're well spoken. I think they're good points. What I was thinking more is around, like you said, it's embedded in the project-based learning is explicit instruction, right? But it should be, right? But this sort of just-in-time type explicit instruction basically divides your attention to each student by how many projects are going on and how different the projects are from each other, right? Like, so if I was teaching about volcanoes and I was doing it the explicit way, I would have all my students sitting there. They're facing me. They're mostly in rows or at least groups that are facing the front of the board. And I would I would have my presentation already. I have a whole map of what they need to know about volcanoes, and I would go ahead and I would teach it, and I would use formative assessment to ensure that they all know it. I use mini whiteboards all the time, so I would be like, so a volcano is, everybody shows me their whiteboard, and bam, I know who has volcanoes, who knows about volcanoes, and who doesn't. And I would create a small group, like through RTI, where I would be sitting there with that small group. I'm going to make sure you know volcanoes no matter what happens, because you're going to get this small group attention. Now with projects, let's say you have 6 projects going on. That's not an unreasonable amount. I've seen 30 projects in classrooms at project-based learning where every project is completely different than the next person's project. That sometimes goes under that Genius Hour umbrella, but I've worked at schools where 25% of the time, I think it was 20% of the time, was dedicated to Genius Hour projects. They're all going ahead and doing all these different projects, and you're sitting here going to each kid and trying to instruct them on the knowledge that they need. And you've divided your attention so much that essentially you've removed you just can't get around to it enough kids in order to teach them that material.
Right. So I wouldn't advocate for anything like that unless you were doing, Genius Hour or something like that, in which we can, argue whether how much 20% or 10% or 5%, whatever. I always say to teachers and leaders, like, in almost all situations in schools in the United States and other places, there's a content and there are things you're going to be held accountable for, right? There are things you should be teaching, right? So Genius Hour, those kinds of things are outside of that realm for the most part, right? So what we're trying to do in the work that we do is we have a class, and all of the class needs to know about volcanoes as part of the project. And there might be different sort of products or things that they might have some autonomy in how they're doing things. And I think autonomy, we could talk about that, but autonomy is not something that teachers should feel like they should give their kids 100% autonomy. And we talk about that very explicitly, saying, give the kids the autonomy that they can handle, and maybe a little bit more, but certainly not a lot more, right? And the reason we're teaching about volcanoes is because they need to know about volcanoes for this thing, right? So I'm going to go back to my example about the multiplying and doing arithmetic with decimals, right? We need to know, so I'd written a blog piece recently of a project that I helped a first-year teacher with several years ago. She was my daughter's fifth grade teacher, and brand new teacher, fearless, first-year teacher characteristics that you might imagine, right? You're familiar with them. I'm familiar with them. And she said, well, we sat down, we said, what do we want them to learn? Well, one of those things, there was, several things. It was using Common Core math at that point, because Kentucky hadn't created their math, hadn't adopted their math standards until 2019. And multiplication, addition, subtraction, all those things with decimals, right? So well, what would use that, right? So we asked the students, and the local pizza place asked them to create, with our help and sort of set up, right, a tipping guide, right? What are one of the things you need to know in order to create a tipping guide and understand that? Well, the math and how to do that with decimals. So when we got to that was on our need to know list. It was number 3, number 4, whatever, in no particular order, but all right, so we've identified we need to know how to do that. So now, today, tomorrow, Friday, whatever, we're going to, Miss Rowling is going to teach and assess, just like you would, those skills. And so it wasn't, everybody's doing those kinds of things. Because I agree with you, like that would be a tremendous time efficiency snafu.
Yeah. So if I'm getting it right, you started by framing the project kind of at a higher level, right? Like, kind of, let's zoom out. Let's look at what's the big goal of this project? Who are we working with, right? So
Right.
it kind of creates
A driving question, how can we create a tipping guide for Hometown Pizza? There was a letter from them with some of the, parameters of, this is what I'm asking you to do, this is how long it should take, some of those things. And then I actually co-taught and facilitated, and there's pictures of it in the blog piece. So you can see, what do we need to know? We need to know, what is a tip? Like some of those fundamental questions, and sort of unpack those things. In our planning, there were things that I knew we wanted to get students to articulate, and so we facilitate that. We sometimes, depending on the project, sometimes it'll be partway through the project, they don't even realize they needed to know that. Sometimes you need to pull it out a little bit more. But if you don't get it up on that list, then there's no reason to teach it. And if they don't need to know it for the project, then there's no need to teach it. And there's no need, that kind of thing. So, yeah, so that's the frame.
Yeah, nice. I mean, so like you said, so explicit instruction, the I do, we do, you do piece was really dedicated to, let's learn all of the foundational skills necessary to complete this project. And I mean, would you say that really the work on, I don't really know what the project bit is, would that work was sort of happen towards the end?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So there were sort of 3 stages, and it was a fairly short project. And as I say in the blog piece, it's not meant to be an exemplar project. Like first year teacher, certainly some things we would have done differently. The first was, sort of grouping the numbers together and working with those numbers. And the second piece, I think, was the actual math, addition, subtraction, those kinds of things. And then once, I think, and I don't know if it was quite this linear, but at some point then we started designing the tipping guides, right? And you can see pictures of them. Some of them were doing it on the computer. Some of them were drawing it. Those kinds of things. But and some of that might have been happening simultaneously with the math learning. I don't remember, structurally exactly how that went. It was 2017, but yeah, we didn't start off the first thing saying, all right, well, let's just go ahead and design it, right? You don't want to just let the students loose. I always say, don't just let the students loose and say, I'll see you in 3 weeks, and let's hope you've actually done something or see what you've learned, right? So there should be and has to be quite a bit of structure, quite a bit of instructional guidance, quite a bit of scaffolding and assessment, and I would say direct and explicit instruction. The big thing that I kind of come back to is building that skill of helping them identify what are the important questions that one needs to know, right? And because my daughters, I have 2 daughters, 13 and 15, and sometimes I use this as an example. Several years ago, they were all into slime, right? They were making slimes. They all wanted to do slime. So my youngest daughter, Lila, says, I want to start a slime shop. And I said, oh, okay, well, what do we need to know in order to do that? And I took a picture of it. She actually never followed through with it because it seemed like too much work or whatever. Kids are fickle with their things, which is one of the problems of discovery learning, right? That is a real reality, right? So she made up a list, really not with a whole lot of help from me, that was a pretty solid list, but I guided her in some of those ways, right? So your beginning students wouldn't be able to do that, but my hope is as she's an adult and in other academic settings, or in academic settings, that wasn't an academic setting, she would be able to say, oh, I want to buy a car. What are the things I really need to think about and learn about? As opposed to, I'm going to go into a car dealer and they'll sell you a car. They'll give you, this is unfair, but they'll give you the direct and explicit instruction of how to do that, right? So that's the really big thing that I think we might be missing, and importantly missing, if we don't include it.
And hey, having kids generate questions, I think it's great. But so here's how I determine, and how I think a lot of this literature we've been referring to would determine when it's appropriate to ask a question and have students generate their own responses to it. And it all comes down to prior knowledge. Right? Like I have a daughter who doesn't know the word slime because she's 3, or maybe she does, I don't know. Right. But The idea, and she doesn't know how basically anyone would set up a shop. She doesn't really know what economies are, right? She doesn't really know how any of this stuff works. Just the other day we were talking about why is it night, right? And so I can ask the question, why do you think it's night? And I will get a very childish, sort of unsophisticated answer because she doesn't have any prior knowledge in the domain.
Right.
Where is it necessary to provide that initial stimulus, that initial explanation and example, is when you're pretty sure, or through your pre-assessment, that the student just couldn't possibly answer the question because they don't know anything about it.
Sure, yeah.
So school is loaded full of these opportunities because we're moving kids forward constantly, right? The point of education is not to have someone be exactly the same as they were at the beginning. The point is that they're completely a developed, they're an educated man and woman, right, by the end of it. And so that's the piece, right? Like, you asked questions to this group, and my assumption, not having been there, would be that they know a lot about that topic. There probably were students in that group that didn't, and maybe 2 or 3 or maybe a third, right? And in that case, that's where I find really extreme versions of progressive teaching to be extremely inequitable. We basically start with a big question that all the kids at home who get to talk about it with their parents, they all know the answer to, or maybe they have after school tutoring, or who knows, they have just a very rich childhood full of lots of experiences. They come into that big question and they look around and everyone's answering. And they're sitting here going, why don't I know anything about this? And it makes them disengage. It makes them feel lousy. It doesn't lead to them being able to catch up in a lot of cases. So that's why it's like, in advance of the questions, teaching some basic things that can put everybody on equal footing, to me would make sense. Or maybe you're right, the project was perfectly pitched and there was no need to do that. But with my daughter and the question about night, it's sort of a fool's errand to just keep asking her questions and try to have her generate responses to a question she doesn't have enough background to answer the question. You know what I mean? Right.
Yeah. Well, so I think that gets at the sort of criticism, or whatever you want to call it, like, you can't ask great questions about something you don't know much about. And I agree, right? And so one of the things, of course, as a good teacher, you need to do some formative assessment to know, well, like, what do these kids know? I mean, you might make some assumptions, right? You might make an assumption that a 10th grader knows how to add, right? But you would quickly find out, right? With a 3-year-old, I wouldn't assume that she would know slime, right? So one would have to, and maybe this is not the best example, but provide some context, which is essentially like, some teaching, pre-teaching, or whatever you want to call it, right? So when we do a project, we want to have some sort of an entry event, right? Something that it could serve a number of different functions depending on what you're trying to get. And, maybe your kids do know a lot about, or enough about, this kind of content or idea or problem to be able to generate questions, and that's not going to be a problem. But sometimes they don't even know it's a problem worth solving, or even know that it's a problem, right? So sometimes you use an entry event, whether it might be a guest speaker, a field trip, a reading, a question formulation technique, to sort of get them to think about it and create some of that context, right? So it's sort of like that graphic you see with the glacier, right? You see this little glacier that looks big to us up above the water. Of course, everything below is just giant thing, right? And so I think when people say you can't ask great questions about things you don't know much about, I think that's generally right, unless you just get extremely lucky. So how do you sort of scratch the surface and then teach some, scratch the surface, teach more, like that you get that richness of, maybe the underwater part of a glacier is not all that rich, but that depth and breadth of knowledge that comes with digging under the surface. So Now, whether that's a terribly efficient way to do it or the best way to do it, and how much you want to commit your time to doing that investigation to dig is, I think, a worthwhile question, right? And another question that I think is worthwhile, feel free to comment on any of that, but one of the things that people say, and myself included, and I wonder about this, is to do project-based learning well and inquiry learning well, it requires a specific skill set and can be really challenging. It's a real challenge to do it really well. And I honestly wonder, okay, so if we try to do project-based learning and it's done poorly, and I think there's plenty of examples of that, it can be disastrous, and we don't want that, right? No, by the same token, we could do some version of direct and explicit instruction really poorly, and it can be somewhat disastrous as well, right? So, we have to acknowledge poor teaching is somewhat disastrous, right? But, is it the best use of our time? Maybe it's not something we do all of the time, but I don't know. I've just thrown a lot at you there.
Yeah, let me go back to that scratch the surface description, which I really liked. I've never heard anyone say it that way, so I thought that was good. A lot of my PhD research and all that is around how to sequence examples with problem solving, and sort of this is basically how teachers teach, right? Do I start with lots of problem solving and give an example at the end? Do I give an example first, followed by a problem, and then what do I do after that? Right? That was basically my whole dissertation. And so when you describe at the beginning, just giving some of that background knowledge, some context, a guest speaker, a text. Right. To me, I put that in the category of an example, right? And when we go into the next phase, you have students do something with it, ask a question with it, talk with their groups. I would put that in the category of a problem. Right. Mm-hmm. And so they find again and again that the best format for examples and problems is simply example problem pairs, right? We go an example, then a problem, an example, then a problem, because what you're doing is you're having students deductively, deduce from an example, like what the meaning is, inquire, if you will, into the example, and then problem solve, use it, do something with it, and then back again, right? And so to me, this is great teaching. If I've labeled that explicit instruction because that's what all the folks we've been referring to do. And if that's what's happening in project-based learning, then great, right? If it starts with giving some background, having students do something with it, and so on and so forth until at the end they develop this rich scaffolded project, I think it's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's what I've maintained for the last, I don't know, however long years in some of these sort of Twitter spats or whatever, spats probably is not a fair word, but my sense is that the way that I characterize project-based learning and the ways in which, direct and explicit instruction is actually happening, that there is significant overlap. And that's what frustrates me, perhaps more than anything, is that, and not you, and we've had this back and forth on Twitter, you're like, that's not me, I'm not doing that, right? But there is this sort of mindset, and I don't know if it's part of the sort of political polarization spiral we're in, where it's like us versus them, right? There's us and then there's them, right? The progressive educators who are causing harm with all this stuff. Yes, there are progressive educators who are really poor at their work and jobs, and they're not doing good work and perhaps causing harm. By the same token, there's some on the other side, if you want to use that, right? And so, what I wish we could do a better job of, or wish these players and these folks would do a better job of, is finding the common ground, right? So, when I talk with John Hattie on the podcast, one of the things, and he's, been pretty vocal against inquiry and project-based learning, he says, when it's done really well, essentially, I'm paraphrasing and maybe butchering his words, but when inquiry is done well, when project-based learning or whatever you want to call it is done well, it can be really powerful. Problem is, it's really hard to do, right? So the question of whether we should be doing it, and I've not ever talked with him. I've interacted a few times with him on Twitter. I think his name is Robert Pondicio. Like his assertion is that it's too hard to do, so we should look to do something more simple, more direct and explicit instruction, and less of that kind of thing. I find that somewhat persuasive. I see the point, right? I mean, do we have the skill set and the mindset and the training and the support and all of the things that go with that to make great teachers? I'm not sure. I certainly have some questions. I still have the same questions even about direct and explicit instruction. Like just because you're making it more simple doesn't mean it's being done well. So I really wish we could have that conversation that was saying like, this is, if we mesh these things together well, it's really powerful, but it takes these things to mesh them together well, and then we can parse those things out. So, that's the thing that I'm trying, probably less than successfully, in responding on Twitter so much now, because I'm sort of like, okay, I've said my piece. Like, let's move on with this, right?
Well, the question you bring up of like, which is more challenging, an ideal full package explicit instruction or an ideal full package inquiry or project-based learning approach. I mean, it's really interesting. I think a lot of the emotional reaction may not be due to like how hard it is to implement. I think a lot of teachers have never seen a great explicit instruction lesson. And I say that as coming from my own experience, being an instructional coach. They've never seen a teacher who can, through a very brief presentation, give a clear and concise example, and then turn it on the students to create a response and basically alternate through an interactive phase that leads to a high success rate on their learning. They haven't seen that. They've seen this boring 30-minute lecture, or they remember their university professors who were extremely boring and couldn't present anything.
Which is a straw man version of direct and explicit instruction.
Right. So I mean, to get to the point that I feel like I'm at now as a teacher with the explicit instruction methodology, it takes a lot of work. It takes lots of years, right? So I mean, almost to go against maybe the point of people that are advocating for explicit instruction, I think they're both very challenging.
Right.
Maybe the difference is here that the PBL and inquiry-based learning tend to be, and I know you've disagreed with this, it tends to be that it's more reactive from the teacher. And the reason why is because if they're doing something for which they didn't have any pre-teaching, it's possible they'll go down the wrong path. It's possible they'll fail, right?
Yeah.
And so when you have a system where you need to respond like just in time, like on demand, right then and there, and you haven't had time to prepare for that moment, for that response, you can give the wrong response. You can give a pretty shoddy explanation. You can, maybe there's a lot of things going on, so you kind of leave it for too long, and now the student's over here discovering, right? They're sitting there doing what we don't want them to do for extended periods of time. Where explicit instruction is completely proactive. I'm preparing my lesson with a goal in mind, and we're all going to get there, row in the boat together, arriving at the same place, and I can anticipate errors because of that model.
Right. Well, I would say, so yes, I think direct and explicit instruction done well is really difficult to do. It's a challenge to learn how to do well, and project-based learning done to do that well is a challenge to do well. And here I'll go against my advocacy is that, again, my version of project-based learning includes direct and explicit instruction. So not only is it challenging to do that, it's also challenging to do this. So, I do think there's a reality there, right? We have other things going on, or maybe two things going on, at least two things going on at once, and doing those things well, I think is a real challenge. So yeah, I don't know. It is a real frustration, and I sympathize and empathize. I talked with, and I actually had a chance to meet up with Catherine Birbelsing in New York City just serendipitously, and she was on the podcast some time ago. But I think the way that she is running Michaela is probably doing some really great things, even though she's the most terrible person in the world. And and she and I had a really great discussion. We couldn't have as long a discussion as we wanted, but one of the things again that I really think is missing from that approach, not that it's totally missing, it's not, I don't want to mischaracterize it, because I get tired of people doing this of the work that I'm advocating for. It's not that questioning isn't happening. I'm sure and certain that the teachers you're working with and the way that you work, and that the teacher she's working with and what she advocates for includes quite a bit of questioning, right? I can't imagine that it doesn't, right? Certainly don't want to think it's just the teachers standing at the top of the front of the class, pounding away with the information and then sending out quizzes. But are those students getting the practice of identifying the important questions? And to me, that is such an important skill that I don't know how else we build that in education. And maybe the education's not the place to do that. I don't know. Maybe we're not equipped to do that. I don't know. But it seems like such an important skill set. And one can argue that, hey, they need to know how to read and write and numeracy and literacy, but do they need to know how to do advanced math? Does everybody need to know all of their history facts, all of those things? Ideally, yes, wonderful, right? But can you and do people flourish in life without all of that rich knowledge? Yes. Would they be better for it? Of course, right? Are they better off in life if they gain that skill of inquiry? And I think arguably, yes, maybe not. I don't have any research and evidence for it, but it seems intuitively true to me.
I think so. The ability to ask great questions and inquire into something, I think it's uncontroversial. We have to build that capacity, right? But I think that there's two ways to approach it, right? There's directly teaching it, right? Like teaching how to ask a good question. Mm-hmm. And then there's indirectly teaching it through building prior knowledge, right? And I lean towards that second one, mm-hmm. because it's kind of obvious when you give examples in real life. Like, for example, I recently bought a house, like 4 years ago now. I recently mm-hmm. bought a house. In that house hunt, I was going to multiple houses, and I don't work with my hands. Both, I was raised in by a single mom, with who doesn't have those skills, and I don't know any of the ins and outs of real estate. I don't know anything about whether that house was mm-hmm. just a piece of junk underneath the hood, right? And so I arrived there being a PhD educated adult who's relatively successful, right? I arrive in that situation unable to ask any of the right questions in that scenario. Sure. It's the same with plumbing. It's the same with carpentry. For me, it's the same with any of those things. However, if you ask me to inquire into an education research article, I know a lot of the methodologies now. I know a lot of sort of what makes a good study and a bad study. And so mm-hmm. I can ask, I think, pretty sophisticated questions about that specific domain. Sure. Yeah. And so that's where I think, like, direct instruction, explicit instruction, that's where it is useful for teaching how to question. We don't just say, like, I'm going to teach you how to ask questions. Now don't do it yourself, right? We're right. saying, I'm going to build you up in the pyramids of Egypt and sarcophagi and whatever when we're doing a unit on Egypt. And then let's have you generate some questions. And all of a sudden, the questions are free flowing. They have so many questions and leads because of all this explicit teaching that happened in advance of their questioning. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I think I don't disagree with any of that. I certainly think it's very true, right? I was recently thinking about that. I was at the doctor's office and he was looking at my shoulder. And no, I'm not a doctor. I'm not an orthopedic
specialist, so the questions that I was asking were not particularly specific, right, or sophisticated, right? Now I've done a bit more research, and to your point, like it's the prior knowledge, like I'm building knowledge. Oh, so I know this. Okay, so that's how that works. And then, well, what if it did this? Right? And I did ask, him, what question should I be asking, right? And I say that because your point is well taken, that we do need prior knowledge to ask better and more sophisticated questions as a learner, as a teacher. Like one of the realities of being a teacher is the first time you go through a curriculum or a class, you know usually very little about it compared to the fifth time through, and you know the important questions to be considering and asking, right? Which is another problem of how teachers get moved around, and you're teaching this, now you're teaching that. Like, good Lord, let me teach something and learn it, right? But that's a whole other podcast. So do people, being in the doctor's office or at the mortgage broker or whatever for your house, or the real estate office or whatever, do they have the skill, and how do we develop that skill to, number one, recognize I don't know enough about this, I need to know more, and to dig and do that process of, it's in some sense, it's almost a mindset, right? Because I do think there are a large number of people, and I use the 2008 housing crisis as an example. Like, people went in and said, I want to buy a house, and people, the realtors and bankers said, you can afford this, and they were in way over their head. They didn't know the questions. They didn't even think to know or think about the questions, right? They were, maybe an argument could be made, and maybe this is unfair, used to being told, or, again, the direct and explicit instruction analogy probably is unfair, but like, I have the information, I will tell it to you, and you will then do that because I say, this is the house you can buy, and here's a mortgage you can afford, and this is the part of town you should be in. You see what I'm saying? Like, they don't even know that they should be asking questions, if that makes sense, right? So building that skill, which project-based learning and what I'm talking about isn't by no means is the only way to do that, right? There's certainly other ways, and it's not the only way to do it. It's not the only way we should be doing it. There are other things that need to be happening to help develop that mindset. But I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally does. I think there's two parts, and here I wrote this down because I thought it important to mention. Right, I think no matter what class or type of approach you're taking for your class, you have to come into it with like a curiosity or an inquiry mindset. Right. Mm-hmm. When I'm teaching, even if I'm directly teaching something by showing step by step how to do something, I'm sitting there thinking aloud, going like, oh my goodness, this is so interesting. Oh, like, what kind of questions could I ask this? Oh, here's a couple, right? And I'm modeling. I'm doing that metacognitive talk. Right. I'm giving lots of opportunities for other students to ask their questions about it. But mm-hmm. what they're inquiring into is my instruction. Essentially, they're analyzing my instruction as opposed to generating questions on something that for which they may not have prior knowledge about, like we just discussed, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second piece is that, it's sort of unbelievable. At least it was to me when I read about the influence of prior knowledge to a whole host of really positive outcomes, but it's automatic when you know something about something. And so my father-in-law knows a lot about houses, right? He came along and tagged along with me, and he's asking all different types of questions about this and that, and I'm going, yes, and I'm writing down, and I'm learning from his expertise. But my actual dad was a lawyer, and his problem solving or inquiry mindset dissolves the minute he tries to apply his knowledge of houses to the knowledge in the domain of law, right?
Right.
And so that's the thing, is that we can develop these through our inquiry mindset, our curiosity mindset. We can have whole groups of students really engaged in asking questions at the same time as realizing the best predictor of them to be able to ask questions and problem solve is having a lot of knowledge in that domain.
Right. And so, but can you imagine that you said your father-in-law?
My father-in-law is the one that knows about houses. My actual dad knows a lot about law, and they don't transfer.
So can you imagine another person like your father-in-law who actually does know a lot about houses, but doesn't have the ability to ask really, good questions?
I mean, yeah. Hypothetically, right? Or in reality, we know people like this, right? They've arrived at a level of expertise, and they don't, and you might call it a skill, right? They don't have the skill to engage their mind in the process of problem solving and asking questions, right?
Right.
Do we get students to get better at that through modeling it as a teacher and then having them do it through a gradual release, or do we have it, or is the project somehow, not to be mean, but does the project sort of magically do that in the process of doing the project? That's where I find that it probably doesn't, right?
Right, but the modeling is the facilitation process when done well, right? So it's like, and I do it with teachers. We do it in our workshops. It's like, all right, what do we need to know in order to create projects that will better prepare students for the modern world? And there are things that I want them to be asking, and I'll provide some stimulus, and maybe they're not asking about this, so I'll, what about this word here? Let's unpack that, right? So I'm modeling that process for them, and I think that is really important. And teachers will say, well, what happens if I say, what do we need to know, and they don't have any questions? Well, it's likely to happen, right? So especially as they are novice at it, more novice at it, you are going to have to be more manipulative and more of that modeling and more of that. One of the things I say to teachers in their planning phase is, I say, first of all, we want to start our planning, if you want to use Bloom's taxonomy as a guide, and again, you can like Bloom's taxonomy or not, but it's a visual that we can use. It's simple enough, right? And people know it. It's a shared knowledge, right? It's a prior knowledge, and so we start our planning at the understand and remember. What do we want them to understand and remember? And then when we start the project, we start the students at the top of, we ask them to create something. We identify with our help what we want them to understand and remember, and then through the project, we're working with it in a number of different ways, analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating, those kinds of things, which is, I would characterize as critical thinking. So, that idea that we're developing that skill, it does take some work. It does take some time. And the less prior knowledge they have, in addition to the skill of being able to do it, the harder it's going to be, right? So you might need to create more context or pre-teaching or whatever you want to call it. If they have more prior knowledge on it and they still don't have the skill, then you're going to need to scaffold and help and model that skill. And I say, well, let's take our content standards, which are often in the form of statements, turn them into questions. And then once they're in the form of questions, think about how structurally am I going to provide stimulus and phenomena that will spur those kinds of questions, and perhaps more importantly is how are they going to say it, right? Depending on the age of the student and their developmental level, they might ask a question about recidivism rates, but they might say, why do so many people go back to jail? Because they're not going to say recidivism rates because they don't even know that's a word, right? So if you want to get recidivism rates up on your need-to-know list, you might hear them say a question that is tangential, and you say, are you asking this, or paraphrasing, and they're hearing an adult who knows how to do this, modeling, right? I do, we do, and then you do, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, and what you're describing is so nice, because it's like when you're working towards a project, how do you embed scaffolds, supports, guidance into that process. And I mean, and I guess it's just sort of not your fault that so many of our curriculum materials don't layer these supports on. And and then even there's a more insidious piece than just the curriculum developers and the education gurus who are out there talking about project-based learning. I really do believe our teacher training has created a bias against teaching things. And I say this as an instructional coach. I meet with new teachers and they apologize to me after their lessons. I'm sorry that I explained that thing. We should have done it basically through inquiry, right? I should have given them the chance to discover it on their own. And to which I have to say, like, why, right? Why was it necessary to do it that way? And the answer is always because people have told me that it's more effective. It's long-term learning will happen if they struggle with that material, if they figure it out for themselves. And so like that, it's sort of become my mission to talk them out of that mindset. It may be appropriate for students to explore a concept briefly, but the idea that you teaching is somehow hindering learning is just not borne out by the evidence.
Right. No, I agree with that. And I correct teachers and educators on that as well. I mean, there's a time and a place for constructivism. I'm curious when you might use it yourself. But then there's, years ago I had a colleague and she used this analogy or metaphor or whatever story we want to talk about. She said, if you're in a crowded theater and there's a fire, you don't ask people questions to help them figure out where the fire escape is. You tell them where the damn fire escape is, right? Like, there's a fire. So sometimes expediency is, and just like autonomy, I mean, autonomy is one of the pieces of our project-based learning model. And I say, don't fall into the trap of feeling like you're supposed to give 100% autonomy in everything to students, because that's a train wreck, right? I mean, there's a graphic that I shared. Matter of fact, I think I shared it earlier today on Twitter, because somebody who was in a project-based learning workshop years ago, who is now doing deeper learning work, said, I remember this. And I was like, it's this graphic, right? So the complexity of the task is helps you determine how much autonomy you want to give. So teachers, we joke about, like, teachers often have a Pinterest problem, right? They want everything to be perfect, right? So if it says I'm supposed to give autonomy, I should turn that knob up to 11. Well, the same thing with inquiry. Like, no, not necessarily. There are times when you just provide that information to them because, number one, you don't have the time to do that. Number two, you don't have you don't need to. Like, it's just not necessary, right? So there are things you want to have them struggle with, and like, I'm a big fan of, I don't know, Project Zero Harvard Making Meaning routine, which I think is a really wonderful routine, and we have teachers use it and advocate for it in classrooms. But it's not for every single, like, don't do that every single time, right? So I guess I'm curious, like, when do you use more constructivist kinds of things in your classroom or with your teachers you're working with?
Yeah. I mean, so there's a really great body of evidence around preparation activities, right? And so when I talk about explicit instruction, I would be saying that I start with an explanation myself, fully explaining the concept, at the board or on my visualizer or whatever else. Mm-hmm. But there's an emerging body of evidence that's not necessarily perfect at this point, that doing a little bit of inventing or collaborative problem solving, or there's another thing called contrasting cases, right? Where you give them like two different cases. One's a good one, one's a bad one, have them kind of look into it. You can also just give them a diagram or worked example, right? And have them inquire into it, right? All of these things are said or thought to prepare the learner for the lecture that's going to come right immediately afterwards, right? So I find that to be fruitful if it's not way beyond the abilities of the learners. Mm-hmm. If it's very brief, first of all, if it's going to last forever, you're going to have this situation where every kid falls off off the task and is really frustrated and maybe even develops some anxiety around that particular thing. So like a brief preparatory phase where you're sort of tuning in or something into some material in advance of an I do phase, the research suggests it's probably not harmful and it's probably good, right? So, I mean, I encourage teachers at times to do that. Another thing is it coming from cognitive load theory, which is my specialization, the idea of the expertise reversal effect, right? So like you said with the project, I would never start the whole thing with kids getting hands-on with the project that they don't know anything about the background of the project. But if we look at novices versus experts, and we can go from novice to intermediate to expert in a relatively short amount of time or within a sort of constrained amount of time, that kind of constructivist, progressive type of teaching seems more appropriate at the end when the students have all that enabling knowledge that allows them to inquire, that allows them to discover. So, I mean, those are just two. Basically, preparation activities, I think, are there's some evidence for them, but it's not perfect. And experts, relative experts in a domain, do fantastically, I think, with more discovery type, less guided approaches.
Yeah. Well, one of the things again that I say, I think often, it feels like I say it often, and is I think important to continue to say is, as an advocate of project-based learning and inquiry in particular, that I obviously I think it's powerful and can be powerful, and research has shown that, right? But it's incumbent upon us to do it well, and also incumbent upon us to ask, if we're not doing it well, how bad is that? Like, what are the downstream effects of that? And really think about that, right? And obviously, none of us have magic 8 balls or a magic wand to be able to correct for all of the cracks in the system of professional development and teacher pre-service and schools and families and all of those things, right? So it's sort of like whack-a-mole kind of thing, but I think it's important enough to do. My take on it, of course, is that it's important enough to do that we should really focus on doing it well. And again, I think explicit and direct instruction, if it's not a part of it, then we're missing the boat on that as well. But that's probably I don't know if it's a minority opinion of project-based learning, but it's certainly not an overwhelming majority opinion of project-based learning or progressive constructivists. And I get impatient with practitioners and teachers and professional development folks and educators who sort of speak in these big things of how wonderful it is, and the kids are working together and they're working in real, like, all those things are great. Like, don't get me wrong, right? But we have to focus on some particular things, and just, the behavioral engagement or something like that isn't enough. It's just not enough. And we've got to figure that out. So anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I guess I would I should mention, I think, the importance of sort of developing your craft and using research evidence sort of to inform your judgments towards, if these really are on a continuum somehow, even though it sounds like a lot of times an ideal form of project-based learning embeds a lot of explicit teaching, and an ideal form of explicit instruction could lead to a project. I think really going into the evidence and becoming sort of more research literate is really important for us as a profession. We've seen with like the whole language experiment in early reading, how a free-for-all approach to teaching phonics was a big failed experiment, right? And I think eventually we're going to see a clearer evidence of that in math, but it's sort of similar in math, right? And so and maybe this is because these are basic skills and this doesn't apply to the bigger, more complex skills. I mean, that might be, where your argument is. For me, it's let's focus in on the evidence. Let's develop our ability to inquire into the research that is out there. And so as you're making your judgment of which school you want to work at, what kind of approach you want to take, that it's informed as much as possible, not just from your own experience and opinions, but by evidence.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about that. At least in my opinion, teachers, I don't think, and I don't remember this much in my pre-service, because it was back when the world was in black and white before they turned it to color, and I don't remember a whole lot of research. And that's one of the joys of the work I get to do as host of the podcast. I get to look at the research and look at some of these books and talk to people and that kind of thing. So I think it is, I mean, we've got to continue to ask questions and be critical and analyze and evaluative of our profession work, because it's a far cry from where it should be. There's no doubt about that, regardless of your pedagogical approach. So, Zach, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to share the links, and I know you have a podcast and Twitter and all that good stuff.
Yeah, if you want to continue this discussion, I have a podcast that's aptly named Progressively Incorrect. And essentially I invite guests on who come from a different field or a specific area of this argument, of the sort of great debates of teaching. And we discuss sort of the merits of inquiry, project-based learning, and direct instruction in full episodes. So that's called Progressively Incorrect. Education Rickshaw is my blog. I named it Rickshaw because I was living in Sudan at the time doing all this inquiry-based learning, but it's sort of transformed into kind of a hosting site for the podcast and any sort of opinion-based blogs that I put on there. And then you can find me on Twitter. It's at Mr. Zach G. I'm now Dr. Zach G, but the old one is at Mr. Zach G on Twitter.
Okay. Well, like I said, it's always important, I think, to have these kinds of conversations. I appreciate you coming on, and I actively try to get people on who are somewhat dissonant with my thinking, and because I think it helps us, right? It helps us think through it, and I think, at least I think we found some significant common ground, at least in my thinking, and there's other ways in which project-based learning and all that stuff happens, but my belief is that we actually, the people that I'm arguing with, primarily, we have more common ground than it seems like, and that, like, to me, the sweetest spot of education is what I'm aiming for, and not one of the two sort of binaries of this or that. Even if one of those two might actually be pretty good, it's like, let's aim for that sweet spot. So I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much, Drew.